Welcome back, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled you're here for today's explainer. If you're the kind of person who loves digging into the hidden mechanics of history, language, and ancient texts, you are entirely in the right place. Today, we're unpacking a highly provocative historical thesis derived directly from our source material. We'll be looking at the systematic alteration of ancient Semitic identities. The sources we're examining today present a compelling, deeply researched argument that many of the names and icons widely accepted today are actually the result of calculated imperial edits. We're going to look strictly at the data provided by the sources to understand exactly how this happened. Okay, let's just dive right into it. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the etymological mystery, then translation versus transliteration, followed by the holophonetic shell. After that, we're zooming way out to examine Rome's imperial assimilation strategy. And finally, we'll wrap up at the Council of Ephesus. Section 1. The etymological mystery. To understand the core puzzle presented by these ancient Hebrew and Aramaic texts, we have to start by asking a very specific question about how words evolve, or, I guess in this case, how they devolve. We have to ask ourselves, how did a name that originally meant rescue morph into a word with absolutely zero etymological roots? The sources argue that the modern English name is, linguistically speaking, basically an etymological dead end. It's a word that literally means nothing in its current structural form. It carries no inherent root definition of its own. So how on earth did that happen? Section 2, Translation versus Transliteration. To solve this linguistic mystery, our sources point out that we really have to understand the nuts and bolts of ancient scribal practices when words cross from one language family into another. Now, what's really interesting here is the choice scribes had to make when moving texts across borders. They could translate the word, which means swapping the meaning. Think of taking the Spanish word blanco and translating it to the English word white. The letters totally change, but the core meaning, that stays exactly the same. Or they could transliterate the word. That means just swapping the letters to mimic the phonetic sound. For example, bringing the Spanish word taco into English as, well, taco. You keep the sound, sure, but if the destination language doesn't have a matching root, you completely lose the foundational meaning. And the sources highlight that ancient scribes transliterated, rather than translated, the Savior's name. Which brings us to Section 3, the holophonetic shell. We're now going to track the specific, centuries-long phonetic degradation of this ancient name, exactly as it's documented in our source material. Let's see how this builds. In antiquity, the name was Yehoshua. That's a compound Hebrew root meaning YHW saves. Fast forward to the 1st century, and spoken Aramaic naturally compressed this into the shorter Yeshua. That was the actual phonetic name spoken at the time. Then, from the 1st to the 4th centuries, as texts were recorded in Greek, it was transliterated into Iesus. Finally, skipping way ahead to the 17th century, the letter J became a distinct consonant in English, shifting that Latinized version into the modern English Jesus. The sources report that through this massive, centuries-long game of linguistic telephone, the original Semitic root was completely 100% severed. So let's break down exactly how that link broke. Step 1. The Greek alphabet simply does not have an esh sound. It just doesn't exist. So the esh in Yeshua was swapped out for an S sound. Step 2, Greek masculine grammar generally requires adding an S suffix to the end of a name to show its case in a sentence. Because of this, Yeshua was sort of awkwardly jammed into the Greek alphabet as Isus. According to the sources, because Greek and Hebrew play by totally different phonetic rules, this forced substitution completely destroyed the word's foundational root structure. When you compare them side by side, the contrast is honestly pretty stark. The Hebrew Yeshua physically embeds the Father's identity, YHW, and literally means salvation. The Greek Asos, on the other hand, has no Hebrew root, no Semitic meaning, and does not contain the divine name at all. The sources point out that according to the baseline text of Exodus 23:21, the messenger sent to lead Israel must bear the Father's name. So by substituting a Greco-Roman phonetic creation that has zero connection to the original root, the sources argue that institutions technically caused a violation of this unalterable scriptural law. This actually brings us to a really fascinating Hebrew definition, shav. It translates to emptiness, falsehood, or a hollow shell devoid of original character. The sources relate this directly to the 3rd commandment, the prohibition against carrying God's name to emptiness, which we usually hear translated as taking the name in vain. The linguistic deduction here is profound. If a transliterated name has been completely severed from its original roots of rescue, carrying it perfectly fulfills the definition of carrying an empty, hollow shell. Section 4. Rome's imperial assimilation strategy. So, how did these linguistic shifts become universally enforced? We have to zoom out to the macroscopic historical landscape of the 4th century Roman Empire. The Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine was facing a massive, frankly, existential problem. They needed to merge a fractured, incredibly diverse, and fiercely pagan population with a growing body of new believers. The objective was clear. How do you control this massive empire using a single, unified state religion without inciting a catastrophic civil war and destroying your tax base? I mean, you couldn't exactly force millions of pagans to just abandon their ancient traditions overnight. And this is where our sources present a highly provocative thesis. They state, the factual history behind the formulation reveals a calculated, state-sponsored political strategy. The argument being made here is that imperial institutions didn't create certain widespread doctrines for spiritual reasons. Instead, they were used as political tools to quietly absorb pagan traditions and enforce state control. Section 5. The Council of Ephesus. According to the sources, this is the climax of our explainer, where the ultimate act of imperial religious rebranding was officially institutionalized in the year 431 AD. Let's look at the documented historical mergers that took place here. First off, the council was held in Ephesus. Why does that matter? Well, Ephesus was literally the global headquarters for the cult of Artemis, the ultimate mother goddess of the Greco-Roman world. Second, it was at this specific council that the state formally granted Mary the Greek title Theotokos, meaning God-bearer. And third, the sources argue that this was a direct, word-for-word inheritance of the ancient pagan titles already being used for goddesses like Isis and Cybele. The state essentially needed to provide the masses with a familiar maternal icon to secure their political compliance. And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of that transition. We have ancient pagan iconography on one side, the Egyptian goddess Isis cradling the infant Horus, next to the institutional rebranding of Mary cradling the baby Jesus. The sources argued this was a deliberate visual inversion. Statues and paintings weren't destroyed, they were systematically renamed and repainted to satisfy deeply ingrained pagan habits, all under the new authority of the Roman State Church. To firmly demonstrate just how radical a shift this was, the sources point directly to ancient prophetic texts. Jeremiah 7:18 explicitly condemns offering devotion, prayers, or baking cakes to a maternal religious figure known as the Queen of Heaven. According to our source material, by locking the original scriptures away in Latin and Greek and utilizing these new transliterated linguistic shells, the institution successfully and deliberately reintroduced the exact pagan rituals that the ancient texts vehemently rejected. So the crucial point we are left to ponder is this. If the names and visual icons that have been held most sacred by millions are actually the products of calculated Roman political assimilation and linguistic substitution, what other ancient truths remain lost in translation? It's a wildly provocative question, and it absolutely makes you look at history, language, and these ancient texts in a completely different light. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating source material. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.